Well, thank you all for coming out, first of all. Again, my name is Michael Hurtt. I'm the co-author of this book that we call it The Brick, or the Bible, is the nickname, that my friend Billy Miller and I put together. It took us 10 years of extensive and dedicated research and many, many rabbit holes. And also, of course, like anything like this, we were both so interested in the subject of not just Fortune Records, but everything in its orbit in Detroit at the time. Other record labels, nightclubs, neighborhoods, churches, where these musicians came from, and all their backstories that immediately when we started to do the book, 10 years, it was 11 years ago now, it became very, very quickly obvious that it was going to encompass a lot more than just Fortune Records. So we have Billy, unfortunately, who passed away 5 years ago this month, and I wasn't able to see the finished product, but I knew exactly what needed to be done, and we worked together so well. He and I were just, it was amazing. He was such an incredible partner and co-conspirator in this subject and project. And then our good friend and inspiration, Nathaniel Mayer, who was a Fortune recording artist, had the hit Village of Love in '61. And then, of course, myself. Now, this tells you sort of everything you need to know a little bit, in a sense, because this photo was taken New Year's Eve of about 2003 or something, and we hadn't even really, I mean, we joked at the time about doing a book on Fortune Records, but we hadn't even, actually, really, we didn't actually commit to it until Billy's wife, Miriam, our publisher, got us together and just basically said, you guys keep joking about this, you need to do it. And then he sent me an email the next week, and that's how it actually started. So it was quite a journey in many ways. And obviously the book is named after this song, Mind Over Matter, a great song by Nolan Strong and the Diablos that we'll talk about later. This was Fortune on 3rd Avenue. Now, it started over on Linwood, but it moved here in 1956. And as you can tell, these photos were taken in 1976, 20 years. Well, it almost looked like that the minute they moved in. They were the Browns, Jack and Devra, who owned the label, were pack rats in the greatest sense of the word. They just, were just constantly energized, making these records. Whether they sold or not didn't really seem to compute in their minds about what was worth doing. Devra was the main implementer as far as recording. She was the one who was hands-on with the machine. So that's her with her beloved Ampex 350 tape recorder. And then Jack was sort of the business end of it. He would hustle the records out of the back of a station wagon, literally, and just never tired of the passion of selling these records and promoting these artists that they loved and recorded, no matter how small they were, no matter how obscure. So yeah, there's a couple other photos. The one on the right, it kind of shows you what the studio looked like. But they would get in there, and in the words of Nathaniel Mayer, you could get in there and you could have a party in there. It was garage material. That's what we were dealing with. That's what he told us in a memorable quote. So they started out, Jack and Devra. This is a picture of them in the 30s on the Boblo boat. She was from Cleveland, but originally from Belarus, Russia. And Jack was, a guy from Detroit who had gone to Wayne and majored in accounting. Did some other things, but when he met Devra, she was always writing poetry, always writing sort of the ideas for songs, and that was how they decided to start the label. The other photo here is Jimmy and Esther Syracuse. Now, Jimmy started United Sound, which is the oldest, often credited as the oldest recording studio in the country. It was opened in 1933. The years are a little murky, but on 2nd Avenue, it's still there. And Jimmy basically had a lot to do with the environment in Detroit of basically encouraging competition. He built his own lathes, he built all his own equipment. Back in the 30s, when the major labels controlled everything and you really couldn't put out a record as an independent label, Jimmy helped to make that happen here in Detroit. So this city was really ahead of its time in a lot of ways, and so Jack and Deborah, after their initial foray into sheet music, they decided, well, we need to make a record. And the first record they made, because the music that they were really familiar with was sort of Tin Pan Alley pop music. So the first record they made was Jane's Sweetest Summer Rain. It was sung by Dorothy Dean and Russ Titus, and then Artie Fields, who some of us know is a man who came up with such incredible advertising jingles as When the Rubber Meets the Road, and also engineered records by the MC5 and many other people. His band backed them up. And this is the kind of stuff that they were promoting when they started. It was very pop, very lush orchestral kind of, again, like Tin Pan Alley, Irving Berlin influenced. Perfect example of one of the early Fortune artists was a guy named Bob Manners, who was Liberace's bass player. You see him here with Liberace. He was actually his band leader as well. So that's the kind of stuff they were dealing with. But Deborah's writing these songs, and her songs always had this, basically for lack of a better word, exotic tinge to them. She loved gypsy music. She loved all kinds of ethnic music, anything having to do with Africa or, Tunisia or something like that. And let me go back here. So she would write these songs, Rose of Tangier, Desert Love. These are instrumentals or, orchestral pop records when they first came out, but then she would later record them often with R&B vocal groups. And you'll see right over here the way the records would transition through the years. And right in the middle there was Nolan Strong and the Diablos, who we're going to talk about a little bit more, but they were the ones that really sold the Browns on rhythm and blues. Yeah, there they are again. But so at the time, right there is Rose of Tangier, one of the songs by the Four Kings that I was just talking about, and you can hear all these different influences going on in that song. At the time, Paradise Valley is what you hear about as far as where a lot of the African Americans, the nightclubs and the real African American high life in Detroit was. And here's a couple of clubs that were located there and very, very popular at the time. And those advertisements give you a little bit of an idea what was going on there, as does this photo of Calvin Frazier on the guitar leading his band, and notice the Tweety Bird on the drum kit. And the saxophone player all the way to the right is George Benson, who he just passed away not long ago. Very well-known saxophone player, started out in Detroit and played on some Fortune records, as did a lot of other people like Calvin, who was mostly a blues guy, but he's thought of as a blues man now. But this photo shows you how things were not always easily boxed, easily put into pigeonholes back then, which is part of the beauty of Fortune and Detroit. But jazz, rhythm and blues, jump blues, aka the kind of thing that inspired guys like bands like Bill Haley and the Comets. Bill Haley originally from Highland Park. That type of thing, like the rock around the clock sound, but the earlier, where it came from. So in other words, people like Joe Turner or Wynonie Harris, those shouting, stomping rhythm and blues singers and their rocking bands were the kind of stuff that the Browns quickly discovered, because it was just bubbling up from the streets here in Detroit. And here's the Paradise Theater, which is now Orchestra Hall, and that kind of gives you an idea what was going on back in the day. I mean, this is Johnny Otis discovered. Adam always tells me this, my good friend over here who's helping out with the music. I mean, can we name them, baby? Johnny Otis in One Night, Little Willie John, right? Name the others. Hank Ballard. And Jackie Wilson, all in one night, discovered at a talent show at the Paradise Theater. So, and Bill Randall over there in the corner at the microphone was a huge supporter and just a booster of jazz, and also the mixing of the races, not necessarily on purpose. I mean, he did have a radio show called the Interracial Goodwill Hour, but he basically appealed to teenagers and young people, and he played jazz, rhythm and blues, all kinds of music, kind of like a Symphony Sid who was a famous DJ from New York, and his style, and he would do these remote broadcasts from this teenage nightclub in the basement of the Norwood Hotel, and that's where I got a lot of guys like Kenny Burrell and Yusef Lateef and these amazing jazz guys started, and they would also record for Fortune Records. Here's a couple of examples. This is a record that Billy Burrell, Kenny's brother, is playing on. And then this is up here is another great rhythm and blues record. She Don't Want You Rocking. Well, this is before, quote, rock and roll, but, they were rocking and they were talking about rocking in, 1950 when that record came out. That's Gratiot Avenue, if you can recognize it, downtown and, Grand Circus Park and everything, just to give you an idea. A little bit of where part of Black Bottom was, which was adjacent to Paradise Valley and the neighborhood that a lot of this stuff came from. Now, the gentleman here on the left in the bottom corner is John Lee Hooker. This famous blues man, you know him, you love him. Boogie Chillin' was a #1 smash hit on the rhythm and blues charts in 1948 when it came out, recorded here in Detroit. And Hooker was very primitive sound, but Detroit blues would, as we will see, take that, style really to great artistic success. Meanwhile, we had hillbillies, naturally, the other half of the northern migration that often doesn't get talked about as much, but in Detroit there was a huge Appalachian population coming up here. Especially in the late 30s and early 40s. And, a lot of these people were banned from the welfare rolls. They were unwelcome and a lot of, by landlords. They were forced to cluster together, just like black folks were forced to cluster together. So they brought their culture and their music with them. And, of course, were also discovered by Jack and Devra and would record for Fortune. This gentleman here, Bob Durham, with the guitar, did a song called Skid Row Boogie that's we'll play a little bit of it for you later, but the Browns discovered, jazz and rhythm and blues right at the same time they discovered hillbilly music. Now, how did they discover this stuff? Well, they would go out to clubs and they would just walk in and look for artists, and they put this album out. This came out later. Dave Kirk was a rock and roller, a Fortune rock and roller later on, but when he was 12 years old, he designed this album cover for the Browns. Now, he lived in the neighborhood. He lived in the neighborhood of the Cass Corridor. So that just goes to show the fact that this kid was hanging around the studio, and they said, hey, kid, well, we'd like to design a party record album cover with adult themes, Here are a couple of the guys that were responsible for that party, rockin', hillbilly party sound. We've got Roy Hall here on piano, and then two of his Cohutta Mountain Boys. That's Frankie Broombelow on the fiddle, who was singing on the Dirty Boogie, which was the first big, party hit that Fortune had. And the other gentleman is Tommy Odom, killer guitar player who influenced a lot of country people around here and jazz guys. And they made this record, the Dirty Boogie, that just really burned up the jukeboxes. The York brothers had been stoking this flame since 1939, on wax at least, and even before that in clubs. They put out a song on the Universal label in 1939, Hamtramck Mama, which Fortune reissued 10 years later because they were realizing these party records are really starting to do something. Well, it sounds harmless now, but back then, the vice laws were such that you could go to jail for selling this kind of stuff. You had to sell it under the table. It was, it was very, we didn't realize in the process of writing the book at first just how, far the Browns had gone with this type of thing. But this newspaper ad tells you everything you know. Jack Brown, literally, being threatened with jail time for selling these kinds of records, Now, at the same time, and partially probably because they were doing the party records, they started to put out, Fortune existed, they had no subsidiary labels. They started to put out some other labels under different names. Renown, obviously, Johnny Bucket and the Cumberland River Boys. That was Griddle, Grease, and Daddy. That tells you everything you need to know, a risque song. We've also got the Gospel Crossroad label. We've got Rendezvous, which only put that one record out, and also Rialto, which put out a York Brothers record. You know, basically these labels were sort of meant to show people that, you know, maybe not associate them just in case, one way or the other, with Fortune. That's Hugh Fryer, a great hillbilly artist, not long after he arrived in Detroit in the late 40s. We'll probably talk more about him in a little while, but one interesting thing about Fortune that has always fascinated me is there were so many women involved in the label, especially during the early 50s. And obviously, Deborah Brown was the, you know, spearheader of the whole thing. Without her, none of this would have happened. She wrote songs, she recorded the artists, she produced them. I wanted to say really quick, Grace Brim was a harmonica player, and John Brim, her husband, they did these early records for Fortune. They're from Gary, Indiana, but they came up here and they made these records with their friend Big Maceo Merriweather. They all played on each other's records and helped each other out. And John Brim later was known for, you've probably heard that song, I'm Your Ice Cream Man, that Van Halen did on one of their albums. Well, he did the original version of that. Joyce Songer, an amazing electric guitar player with her husband Earl, absolutely incredible. And again, you know, it isn't that you never saw women playing lead electric guitar back then, but it was somewhat rare. But these people just did it. They were just who they were, and they just, you know, and yeah, she was absolutely revolutionary, really, and ahead of her time in a lot of ways. And also, the songers are interesting because they show a certain style of very, very raw and crude hillbilly music that might not have ever been recorded if it wasn't for someone like the Browns to have captured it. Keep in mind, there were barely any record labels in Detroit at this time that were lasting any amount of time at all. And Fortune would, by the time it was all said and done, last, you know, almost 3 decades actively. But the fact that they even lasted 2 or even 1, and that they were there to capture all these incredible sounds, sort of tells you everything you need to know, because a lot of these folks never recorded for anybody else. Another example, very cool and very influential in the Fortune sound, Boots Gilbert and her band, with her husband Chuck Hatfield, who's playing the steel guitar there, and her sister Dee on guitar, and Dee's husband Vic. I mean, really just almost vaudeville, blues, jazz, hillbilly, everything, all in one on one record. That was their sound, and very cool, and just unique. So, you know, we're starting out with, you know, the jazz, the blues, and then, you know, of course, the hillbilly, which takes any number of forms, you know, bluegrass, western swing, honky tonk, and then later rockabilly. Rufus Schaffner is a prime example of one of the early Fortune artists who stuck around and kept on coming back, which is something that a lot of people would do. They would make a record and then they'd come back 5 years later and make another record, you know. He did a lot of work with Joyce Songer, who we just talked about, and including Orbit Twist, which was their record they put out in 1961. Here's some other great influential Detroit hillbilly folks. We've got Danny Richards, and then we've got his band over here. They recorded a killer record in 1950 for Fortune, and then he, you know, again, returned in the early 60s and made some more records, you know, with the gentleman on the second from right, Chuck Oakes, on guitar, you know, writing a lot of the songs. And, you know, and Chuck would stick around through the rockabilly era, and he would play in a lot of records throughout the late 50s. Al Allen, who was better known as Jack Scott's guitar player, he's the gentleman second from right here. Jack Scott, as some of you may well know, is a, you know, amazing rock and roller from Detroit, the original rocker from Detroit, who was pretty much, you know, neck and neck with Elvis in the late 50s. From 59 to 61, he had 19 chart singles, which is more than Elvis did, and he actually had more hits than Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, who are often thought of as rockabilly heroes, combined. So he was really incredible. Al Allen lent him a certain mood with his guitar playing. Al Allen played on all of Jack Scott's hits for the Carlton and Top Rank labels, and here he is, you know, in that era on the right-hand side. And this is Chuck Oakes, who I mentioned earlier. Rock the Universe, it's coming. Oh, there he is, yeah. Skeets McDonald, the gentleman who did Tattooed Lady, you heard a little bit of it earlier, right here on bass playing with Big Chief Redbird, who made a fantastic record for Fortune. And this just goes to show the kind of people that they were attracted to and just how individual some of these folks were. I mean, he was actually, you know, Chief Redbird was actually, of course, he was 100% Indian, you know. His grandmother was on the Trail of Tears, and his recording career actually stretched back to the 20s. Here's Jack Scott again and Al Allen in the studio. Maybe a pensive moment, who knows, after recording one of their smash hits. That's Chief Redbird right there, playing. So now we get to the era that most people think of when it comes to Fortune Records, which is DooWop, aka vocal group rhythm and blues. The Diablos and the $5 were two of the big groups. The Diablos were the big group, and Nolan Strong would later emerge as the sort of hero, the fallen hero in a sense of Fortune Records. But Andre Williams was showing up to throw a wrench into the engine, thankfully, as he always did. Andre is at the mic there, and also on the far right with his group, the $5, a group that he joined when he came to Detroit and won a talent show right here at the Warfield Theater, which was on Hastings Street. Jail, baby. Turn it up a little bit, baby.
I'm ready. Yes, before it's too late. Trying to get away from that jail, baby. It's a rough temptation.
That tells you everything you need to know about Andre, but there's so much more to tell. This guy was super creative. I mean, I'll leave the expletive out, but one of his great quotes was, I had to, you know, this was the era of all the high tenors like Clyde McPhatter, the guys that we just absolutely worshipped in these exquisite vocal groups. And, you know, I knew I had to figure something out because not only could I not sing like them, I really couldn't sing at all, but I had to figure something out or I knew I'd fall through the effing tomb. And what he figured out was basically talking his way through records, dancing, clever lyricism. I mean, he really, and we'll come back to Andre in a minute, but just to give you a little bit of a smattering of what was going on at the time, the Royal Jokers, a group that had made records under multiple names previously, but really came into their own as the Royal Jokers. They had a big hit on Atco records before they recorded for Fortune. But this poster here shows you the kind of shows that were going on back then. I mean, you know, you had the Don Juans and the $5, who were the same group, the Fortune group. You had Yusef Lateef, who we all know is a jazz man. We had the Australian Jazz Quintet. We had Little Willie John, you know, rhythm and blues star, King Records from Detroit. And then Della Reese, also of Detroit, pop rhythm and blues star, cultural icon. Bobby Lewis, who would later do Tossin' and Turnin'. They're all playing on the same gig, you know. It wasn't like we're going to do a rhythm and blues show, we're going to do a jazz show, we're going to do a rock and roll show, we're going to throw it all together. And that tells you a lot about the time and Detroit. This also, the bottom photo also tells you a lot. You may not be able to quite make out what's going on, but the Royal Jokers are on stage, and Norman Thrasher, one of their most active members, is on his back, and he doesn't want to stay, with his feet in the air in the aisle of the theater while the kids go crazy. So, you know, that tells you something right there. Now, on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, the ethereal, more laid-back vocal group sound, the Swans from Toledo, who were a legendary group and have been almost considered mystical in the annals of Fortune Records. People absolutely love their wedding bells, this 78 that's pictured. And they were, what was interesting about them is that you'd think that a group that made a doo-wop record in 1954 wouldn't still be around, but nobody ever knew who they were. And Billy and I somehow found the lead singer, because he was later in a 60s garage band, Baron Thomas. And he was still alive, and I called him, and all these guys are still around. They haven't sang since the 50s, but they all still are around. So that was really cool. So we were able to get their story. It had never been written before. Now the Diablos, again, Nolan Strong, all the way to the right, and his boys. I mean, these guys were Fortune Records. If any one group or artist could be, you know, besides Andre and Nathaniel Mayer. You had the Diablos, aka Nolan Strong, and Andre and Nathaniel. They were Fortune's big three. Well, these guys were first. They all went to Central High School, which was across from Fortune, the first Fortune studio on Linwood, and that's how they went in there to try to see what they sounded like on tape. And the rest is history, as they say. The first record that came out was Adios My Desert Love, which Smokey Robinson has always talked about, in fact recorded a demo version that never came out with his first group, the Chimes. But Smokey's always said that Nolan was one of his favorite singers, and he says that unprecedented and unprompted in every interview he does. Again, here they are playing with opening up for Stan Kenton, the jazz guy, the white jazz guy over in Windsor. Again, it just goes to show the way music was thought of back then. It wasn't so much put in a box like it tends to be now. The Wind. This is the Diablos' second record, but Fortune's first huge hit. It really doesn't sound like any record that came before it or any record that's ever come since. And it was a huge influence on Lou Reed. He absolutely loved Nolan. We have a quote in the beginning of the book from Lou. He says, if I could sing, I would have been Nolan Strong. And if any of you have seen that new Velvet Underground documentary, it was really a great feeling for us to have that song played as the first, song in the film. It wasn't a Velvet Underground song. Talking about Lou and how much he loved the Diablos. These are the $5. We talked about them a little bit before. Andre's friends that and then frenemies because they had a huge falling out in the mid-50s. And Andre formed this group, the new group. Andre Williams and his new group. With Gino Parks, who is all the way to the right there on the end, and Jay Johnson, who's behind him, second from right, who's still around and healthy and doing great and was a great help with this book, as was Gino and Andre. These guys made this song Bacon Fat, which is, again, not like many other songs. Check out the lyrics. When they start singing here, it's a little bit of a travelogue. These guys jumped in a car and just drove down south to Memphis. Just went, in the words of Gino, and basically just to see what they could do. While they were down there, they wrote this song. It's a travelogue about their journey to Memphis, and they got their act together on stage. They came back to Detroit in the fall and recorded it, and it was such a big record that Epic licensed it. Now, the Browns were always very paranoid about licensing their records to bigger labels, and later on that would come into play. Part of the reason is because of what happened with that Epic record. They never got paid for it, or at least they said they didn't. Or they didn't think they got paid enough. So Andre was on a roll in multiple manners first with the $5, then with the new group. Then the new group quickly splintered over the success of Bacon Fat because they had all contributed to the song, but Devra put her name on it. So that was done, and Andre stuck with Gino, and they partnered up, and they started to make, he and Gino Parks started to make records like the Greasy Chicken and Put a Chain on It. Now, this photo, I just want to say, just to give you guys an idea, the Garfield Hotel, that's what that is. And that's on, what is it, the corner of John R. and Mac, is that right? Just north of Mac, right. And that's where Andre lived during this time. He lived in the Garfield. And the Garfield was a African-American hotel that was quite legendary, but also quite affordable. You know, it wasn't like, you know, everything had to be, you know, I mean, just because it was nice didn't mean you couldn't actually live there. And a guy like Andre that was of somewhat modest means, but still sort of a star. And I just thought it was just really cool. Adam dug this photo up, and when we got it, it was just incredible to think about Andre living there when he made these records. And here he is with Gino performing, you know, their duet, which by all, we'll get to that one in a minute. You know, by all witnesses was just absolutely amazing, hilarious, the whole 9 yards, and everybody would show up for him. And they would just basically get up and ad-lib on the stage, kind of like I'm doing right now, off of each other. And Gino always maintained, well, you know, our records weren't that great. We were just making records for a $10 bottle of wine or whatever. And Andre said the same thing. But yet they both loved each other so much that it was so, and we think the records are the greatest things ever. I mean, that's just how it goes. You know, the artists just think, I'm just doing this, but, you know. So I love that picture of Gino on the right because it's sort of like, you know, captures the way he probably felt about a lot of things at the time. And also some of the records he would later make for Motown that Andre was also involved in right after this. Right here we have some real heroes of Fortune Records. And Billy, we were going back and forth. You know, it's funny, our friend later became a friend, Armand Abney, was the guitar player in this group, the Earthquakes, and this is his father, Butler. He started the group, which is really cool to have and that's a very Fortune-esque thing, to have like a teenage singing group with, you know, your dad in it. And not only that, your dad founded the group. I mean, some people would think that's square. Not in this case. This is actually really, really cool. I mean, look at Butler Avenue. The guy's just as hip as can be. But before we knew Armand, and we got a hold of him through his brother Marvin, who's here tonight, Billy and me just used to marvel about the earthquakes, you know. And I was looking through some old emails recently, and there's one from Billy saying, if I had a choice out of every Fortune group to find one tape of unreleased material, I think it would have to be the Earthquakes. They're so great. And they are, and were and are. So these are the two records they did, but then Armand returned to the scene like so many people at Fortune and did some records with under a couple different names. We'll get to those in a little while. Hastings Street Opera. Why do we call this section that? Well, it was a song by a guy named the Detroit Count, otherwise known as Bob White, a piano player, where he basically gives a travel log, he's a tour guide to this legendary black thoroughfare, legendary black stroll, Hastings Street, the heart of, you know, Paradise Valley in a sense, but really the heart of black Detroit. And, you know, that record was recorded by this gentleman here, Mr. Joe Von Battle. Joe had a record store on Hastings Street, and in the back, just like the Browns, he had a recording studio set up, very makeshift. Cadillac Woman was one of his most notable and rarest records by a guy named Robert Richard, who later recorded for Fortune with his brother. But Joe, along with the Browns, was the only person that was really capturing this music, you know, blues, gospel, vocal group R&B, as it was coming off the street. I mean, people would walk in the studio, he would meet them, he would say, come back, let's make a record. Sometimes he wouldn't tell them that he was making a record. And that happened with Joe Weaver and the Blue Note Orchestra, who later became Fortune's house band. He would just record everything, and he would try to hustle it to bigger labels if he couldn't put it out on his own label. So he's a very important guy. Again, like the Browns, if it wasn't for Joe Von Battle, we wonder how many of these records, how many of these artists would have even ever recorded. This was a typical scene at the Harlem Inn, which was a real famous blues club here in Detroit during that time. You can tell everybody's having a blast. And over on the right is Robert Richard I call him Richard, but it's probably really Richard. Maybe that's my Louisiana, too much time spent in Louisiana. But the Richard brothers, who recorded for Fortune, and we'll get to them in a minute, after we get to my very good friend, Mr. Eddie Kirkland, on the right there with the guitar. Probably one of the earliest photos of him in action that we've ever seen. Now, this is at the Apex Bar on Oakland, which is actually still there and looks exactly the same. It's famous for being the place where John Lee Hooker was always coming to the gig late, and the bartender would say, "Boom, boom, you're late again." And then, of course, later one of his biggest hits was "Boom, Boom," covered by the Animals and so many British invasion groups. But this is Eddie right here. Now listen to the passion. The band you're looking at is playing on this record, the Detroit House Rockers. I must have done somebody wrong. He wrote this song because he always felt that he was cursed in his life for reasons that we go into in the book. I won't give everything away. But, that song, coincidentally, was almost immediately covered by Elmore James, and then later covered by the Allman Brothers on a million-selling album. Eddie never got paid for that. So that could tell you a little bit about the hard luck that this guy had in his life. Bobo Jenkins is one of the most raw and visceral guitar players and blues singers from Detroit. He really encapsulates that, quote, Detroit sound that I referred to earlier, that Detroit blues sound that John Lee Hooker spurred off with Boogie Chillin'. It's almost the opposite of the Paradise Valley rhythm and blues, which is very highbrow in a sense. Bobo was taught the guitar by Eddie and Eddie Kirkland. And this song, Democrat Blues, was, he went to Chess and recorded that, and then he came back and recorded some records for Fortune. But just a fantastic artist who later had his own recording studio. And this goes to show the influence of people like Jovan Batto and the Browns, that these guys thought, well, I can make a studio too. And his studio is probably even more primitive than theirs, which is saying something. But he kept on recording people until he, throughout the 70s, and had a label called Big Star. He put out a lot of records. Back to the Richard brothers that I mentioned, or the Richard brothers. Drunk Drivers Comin'. Now this is one of these Fortune holy grails that everybody talks about, the record collectors. This is the one, if you had to have one record on Fortune, it might be this one. Well, look at the title. And the flip side is called Stolen Property. This is absolutely almost, I don't even know how to describe it. What did I say in the book? I mean, it was almost like a Coaster song, Lieber and Stoller, wrote or something like that, but it was written by these guys. I mean, it's comedic, even though it's about a drunk driver. Totally primitive, ramshackle recording, amazing. The only record they ever made. Rabbit Johnson, who was a lead guitar player, great, played with a lot of people, but you note he's got Bobo Jenkins' name on his amp, and he's playing Bobo's guitar. Well, he was Bobo's lead guitar player, and he played on a lot of records. Very important guy. You don't hear much about now. Rabbit Johnson. So I put those two together, not because they're connected, other than that they're both iconic Detroit blues images. This is Dr. Ross. Now, Dr. Ross was a one-man band who played guitar and harmonica and sang and drums, the whole 9 yards. He did it all. This was when he was in the Army, and he got his name, Dr. Ross, because he was a medic during World War II. He recorded for Chess. Actually, technically, it wasn't Chess. It was he was actually recording for Sun Records in Memphis, and Sam Phillips was licensing the stuff to Chess. He moved up here because things were just not. He wasn't selling the records he thought he ought to be selling, and he could get a good job at General Motors in Flint. So he moved up to Flint, and right when he got to Flint, he made this record about Industrial Avenue, which is a back then a very legendary street in Flint. And this is right when he got up here in 1955 with his family. Really cool, just an incredible photo that to me says a lot, And here is Dr. Ross a little bit later, opening up for the MC5 in England. Now, what a gig that would have been. But that gives you an idea just about how this guy, who this guy was and how he was regarded. Now, he was also ripped off, just like Eddie Kirkland. Cream did a cover of, recorded his song Cat Squirrel, and he never got paid for that, so he hated Eric Clapton until the day he died. Well, yeah, the story that we actually, I'll give away one story in the book, one little tidbit. Our friend Dan Rose was making a movie called Wayne County Rambling, and he loved Dr. Ross. And so he wanted to have the doctor in his film. So anyway, he got to know him, and he booked him for a gig in New York and everything else, and he was always going to visit him. Well, one time Dr. Ross tells the story about Eric Clapton wanting to come and invite him to a show. He was playing at Flint and everything, so he pulls up in his limousine, to offer tickets to Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross said he was sitting on his porch with a shotgun and told him to get off his property but quick. No, he didn't want to go to the show. He'd rather have a check for the song that you credited yourself with that I wrote. But this does go to show just how the man got around and how well regarded this guy was. Can you imagine what that would have been like? The MC5, cataclysmic rock and roll from, revolution, dope guns, and I won't mention it in the street. Straight from Detroit with Dr. Ross opening up. Very cool. And truly a...
Dr. Ross pulled a shotgun on Eric Clapton.
Yes, Dr. Ross did pull a shotgun on Eric Clapton. And we love him for it. Now, this is Eddie, again, our good friend Eddie Kirkland. Now, Adam and I both, Adam Stanfeld, who's doing the last minute, to his great chagrin, the last minute musical accompaniment over here, played with Eddie. We were very lucky. We got to play a bunch of gigs with him. I also got to play with him in New Orleans at the Ponderosa Stomp, which is a festival that I helped put together down there, starting in the early 2000s before I lived here. The man was just an incredible life presence and an incredible musician and an incredible teacher. And Eddie gives an idea a little bit about the process of writing this book, because I was so fortunate to have not only known a lot of these folks, but actually gotten to play music with them and everything that entailed, which means hanging out, getting amps fixed, going to the Coney Island at 2 o'clock in the morning after the show, solving all kinds of seemingly unsolvable issues, just every problem in the book you could possibly imagine sometimes. But it was all such a great journey and so fun and so unforgettable to hang out with these folks. And that gave me an extra, from my standpoint, it gave me an extra angle as far as when I was trying to put down on paper who these people were and are and always will be and make it live. And I'm sure that Billy, if he was here, would say the same thing, because he and his wife Miriam, our publisher, were so close to Andre Williams. They recorded, they're basically responsible for Andre Williams' comeback after he was homeless in Chicago, along with their friend George Paulus. Just having time with these people is so special and so crucial to something like this, and it's a real blessing. So I love this photo of Eddie. He's got the Confederate flag bandana on his head. I mean, that's so Eddie, in the most absurd and not caring, but yet everything means something way. Great. Anyway, I don't know who the rocker is behind him. It looks almost like it's Jack Scott. I mean, Boland, can you tell? And over here we have Heinz Farm. Now, this is one of Eddie's and John Lee Hooker's favorite venues. It was near Toledo. It's still there. It was an outside place where they had motorcycle races, baseball games, everything. Just a really cool kind of a almost party type resort, if you will. Black, but whites were welcomed. Everybody was welcomed, and Eddie would always play there. He every time he came up there, and he would always talk about it to us. Heinz Farm, the guy someone bought it, they're going to reopen it, and whatever, which, hopefully will happen at some point. So anyway, Hooker played there, and Eddie and John Lee Hooker, by the way, I didn't mention this, started out together. Eddie played on a lot of Hooker's early records, and they were partners on the road and on wax for years and years, off and on. This is Joe Weaver, a piano player and band leader that backed up tons of the rhythm and blues artists at Fortune, and also made his own records with his band, the Blue Note Orchestra, and a great guitar player named Johnny Bassett. Just a really fantastic, these guys made these records in Detroit that almost sounded like they were from New Orleans. They're very influenced. They were Southern guys originally, but just sounded like Gulf Coast stuff. I think that Joe might have been from Alabama. I can't recall right now. But he wasn't really from the Gulf Coast, but their records, fantastic. Now we get to gospel. We can't talk about Detroit without gospel. We can barely talk about Detroit without mentioning Aretha Franklin, but how about her dad, Mr. C.L. Clarence LaVon Franklin, very powerful and influential preacher who also made records and sang on occasion, especially early on, and was very influential to guys like Bobby Bland and B.B. King. He had a couple churches in Buffalo and Memphis and different places before he moved to Detroit, but he came up here and after spellbinding everyone at this National Baptist Convention here, he opened up New Bethel Baptist Church on Hastings, right down the street from Joe Von Battle's record shop. And you had programs like this happening in every church in the city, including his. The Flying Clouds of Detroit, a very influential gospel group. They were kind of the granddaddies of what, we call the gospel quartet sound, which is a small group of people harmonizing. Now, it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 6. They call them quartets. It doesn't matter how many people are in it, as long as it's not a choir or a solo artist, and as long as they're harmonizing. It's very influential on the DooWop sound, the vocal group sound that I talked about before. And this song, Another Soldier Gone, is a prime example of what I'm talking about. You can hear that harmony, that doo-wop harmony in it. But the words are about a soldier dying overseas. Yeah, another soldier gone. And in a sense, it's about a soldier dying overseas, but it's also a shrouded civil rights call to arms, because they're really talking about the human race and how we need to be together, but we're not. And that's always been a theme of C.L. Franklin's sermons, well before the civil rights movement was actually like on paper. These guys were doing it on record and in churches, and they would tell stories or sing songs. They didn't necessarily spell it out all the time, but that's what they were talking about. And that's always been a big part of the gospel history here in Detroit. Here we have a variety of records by, some on Fortune, some on other labels. Gotham, which was a pretty big label out of Philadelphia, the Violinaires recorded the song Sign of the Judgment that was written by a gentleman named Calvin Fair, a real Detroit gospel hero, who would later have a group called the Harmoniers Quartet on Fortune. But the Violinaires are one of the most famous gospel quartets, in existence, but nobody knows they're from Detroit. That goes to show that these guys were recording here and that they were billed as being from here. They became famous later and people forgot. And that's something we cover in the book, because it's so important to know where these people originated. Now, on the flip side of Clarence LaVon Franklin, we have Prophet Jones, who was a faith healer, legendarily, almost proudly crooked. Let me see if I can get rid of that? Okay. This guy, we don't even, we could talk for an hour on him alone. We won't. He was very flamboyant. He looks actually conservative in this photo. By all accounts, flamboyantly gay as well. The Gales, who were actually the Violinaires, recording as a rhythm and blues group, did a song called All Is Well, where they poked fun at Prophet Jones. Prophet Jones would always say, all is well, all is well. That was his tagline. The Gales this is such an insider record. I love it. It's a rhythm and blues group that's actually a gospel group, and they're poking fun at a local preacher. I mean, nobody would know that, and yet somehow it ends up getting recorded. Not only do they write the song, but it ends up getting recorded by JVB and put out. That's so cool. The Silver Harps, one of our favorite groups, Adam and myself and Billy as well. They're still around, they're still singing. And Miss Lillian Rudolph, who's second from the right in that photo, is carrying on the spirit of the group, and they're just fantastic. And they sing at these programs that still take place, or were before the pandemic, almost every weekend here. But you really have to dig deeply to find out where these things are happening, like a lot of other things in Detroit. But it's these types of programs. These are old posters with a lot of Fortune groups and other groups on them, but these kind of programs still go on every weekend here in Detroit. And you'll see the Silver Harps are on that poster right there, and the Victory Five, and who are also a Fortune group. But many of these groups are still around, and they sing with the same kind of spirit that they always did. It's incredible. Rock and roll, we've been waiting for it. In the time we have left, we better get to it, because it was bound up regarding Fortune Records in them moving to 3rd Avenue, which is the studio you've seen, the decrepit-looking studio that was pictured earlier. It was in the Cass Corridor, in the heart of the Cass Corridor, which was Skid Row at the time, 1956, in a social engineering project. Skid Row had been on Michigan Avenue, but they moved it. They actually moved Skid Row, we tell the whole story in the book, to 3rd, and right then Fortune bought their building and moved in, just like clockwork. This would have been these are a couple of scenes from a little bit later, but probably what would have been going on. The day drinking bars, the winos just whooping it up in the parking lot. This was Fortune. This is, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, that photo was taken not long after they moved there. It almost looks like it did when it was crumbling in the 90s. But right away, rock and roll, their move coincided with rock and roll, and the primitive recording aspects of their studio rocked the universe. I mean, this song might be the most rocking of all of Fortune's rock and roll records, and believe me, that's saying a lot. Totally insane. Wait till he says, "Get her, Roy!" Get her, Roy, referring to the gentleman in the middle with the electric guitar. That's Lafayette Yarborough, who's still with us and was very helpful with this book and giving us the, inside dope on everybody and everything, rock and roll and country and hillbilly, going on in Michigan from the moment he arrived here from Mississippi in like 1957. And this is actually another band he was in called the Louisiana Playboys. He was in a lot of bands, and he plays this guitar solo that Adam is going to. And the rest is history, baby. His friend Delvon says, "Get her, Roy," because back then he would always wear cowboy boots, and so as a kid, Lafayette was nicknamed Roy, as in Roy Rogers. Ford Nicks in Japan, the gentleman with the banjo. Now this looks like a rock and roll or rockabilly band, and they are rocking, no doubt. But they could also be playing bluegrass. See, it all was coming together, and it didn't really, again, just like the rhythm and blues, you didn't really have these categories, and that was the beauty of it. Right here on the end, on the left, is Conway Twitty. You guys know him and love him for its only make-believe and countless country and rock and roll hits. He was in Ford's band in Japan when they were in the Air Force together, and Ford's there in the middle with the plaid shirt with the banjo, so that's cool. Well, meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in New Bodheim, Germany, was our good friend George Young, Fortune recording artist, rhythm and blues fanatic, and good friend of Elvis Presley, who he was in the Army with. And you know, it's pretty cool to see Elvis at the piano and George on the guitar, as opposed to the other way around, even though George was a guitar player, but Elvis was too. So these guys were very good friends, and George had a whole presentation he gave on his friendship with Elvis. It was amazing. Jimmy Lee, now this gentleman started out as a bluegrass player, ended up as a bluegrass player and preacher, but made a couple rock and roll records in the middle. Now this is something that happened with a lot of people. His real name was Jimmy Williams, and he played with the Stanley Brothers in some of their most legendary lineups, bluegrass legends, the Stanley Brothers. But when we were researching this book, no one would believe that they were the same guy, except our friends Keith Cady and Craig Mackey, who wrote Detroit Country Music. They knew that they'd gotten the whole story and interviewed Jimmy. But nobody else had ever bothered to ask him about his rock and roll records. So when I would talk to these other historians about Jimmy Williams of the Stanley Brothers, I would say, well, you know, the guy made a couple of rock and roll records in Detroit. Oh, that can't be the same guy. What? It's the same guy. And if you hear the records, you'll hear it. And there he is with his Fortune record, really cool. Johnny Powers, multi-pronged attack as far as Fortune Records history goes. This photo on the right with Jack Scott and Jimmy Kirkland and the boys, I won't name them all, Dave Rohillier, was taken at Bill's Barn, which was literally a barn heated, you know, by wood stoves up north of Detroit, where these guys would, you know, play on the weekends and, you know, develop their rock and roll and rockabilly sounds. Johnny Powers was one of them, and he was one of the most successful guys to come out of that scene. And he made these two fantastic records here in Detroit, and then he also recorded down at Sun Records in Memphis, and then later went to work for Motown, but then came back and managed a couple people at Fortune, which we'll talk about in a little while. This is Tony Vala and the Alamos before they were the Alamos. This is Los Tres Caballeros, the Three Gentlemen, otherwise known as Smiley and the Stars. Their stomping grounds were Bagley Avenue, Mexican Town, that little area right there with the restaurants. It's, you know, there was a big club there called Las Vegas that had a lot of this kind of music, but most of what these guys were doing was too raw for the kind of Mexican, almost big band pop singers that they were bringing in there. This was Conjunto. This was like San Antonio style, raw Mexican music telling a story. Well, Tony, you saw him over there on the right with the guitar. Pretty soon he decides, I love playing the Mexican music, but wait a minute. Maybe I need to start playing some rock and roll. He was already mixing it together because he's from San Antonio, Texas, and that's just what they do down there. So here he is with Jack Smith and the Orbits. That's Jack Smith there, who disappeared later. We wish we knew what happened to him. But the rest of these guys became Tony Vala and the Alamos. And that's Jesse, Tony's brother, on drums. He was an integral part of the group. And they backed these guys up, for instance. The Dell Teams, who are from Toledo. And they also backed up Dr. Ross on Cat Squirrel, which we talked about earlier, the song that Clapton almost got shot over. So they were, you know, the Browns would seize upon these bands. And they would say, well, we need you to record with these people. We got this guy coming in, whoever it was. This gal's coming in, we want to make a record with her, we want you to back them up. And they would always credit them on the labels and everything, so they became their little house band for a while. Or as Jack used to call them, here come the cool cats. Now, sort of the opposite of that were Jim Myers and the Gems. They never backed anyone up because they weren't from Detroit. They came up here and they made records, and then they went back to Ohio where they were from. But they were very proud to be on Fortune. Look, Fortune Records on the drum kit. Jim is a perfect example of a guy, and he's the one with the guitar in both photos, of a journeyman, a Fortune journeyman. He came up here to Detroit in 1952 with a hillbilly band, almost like a Western swing band, and he made a couple of records for Fortune. Then he disappears for 10 years, then forms a rock and roll band, and then he comes back up, makes more records, you know, totally different styles. You wouldn't even know it was the same guy. You know, he called himself Jim Myers on the rock and roll stuff and Jimmy Myers on the hillbilly stuff. You know, again, people were always returning. Everybody that's vaguely familiar with Fortune knows Nathaniel Mayer and loves him. his song I Want Love and Affection at the House of Correction, which was written about, you know, the Detroit House of Correction, aka D-Ho-Co, as he calls it in the song, was really, it showed the bizarreness of Fortune Records and how they would just embrace the weird at any turn, that they would put out a record like that. But we really know Nathaniel from his 1961 smash, Village of Love. There he is, I mean, in all his glory. That drummer is Butch Vaden, who is an integral part of Nathaniel's sound, and also the sound of many other artists, Fortune artists in the early 60s, but he was mainly Nathaniel's drummer. They were very, very close. And again, it just goes to show that race just didn't mean anything to these people, you know, and Butch told us stories about going down, and Nate was born here in Detroit, so they would go down south, you know, in areas that they had to, like, you know, sleep in a house. They couldn't go to a hotel, you know, they had to go to the, you know, back door to get the food, you know, the whole thing, and they were both just like, you know, wow, we're not, you know, they'd never experienced anything like it, but up here, the music just, I mean, and just the culture, I think, too, in general, even though Detroit is often said to be a very segregated city, in the music back then, it was not. This is Nathaniel making his legendary comeback in Southfield, Michigan in 2004. He absolutely demolished the place. Nobody heard from him in years. Nobody knew what to expect. You're pretty much looking at it. We took this photo right before, this is 5 minutes after I met him and shoved a tape recorder in his face for the first time and said, "You have to talk to me." And the interview ended up in the book. This is before we were going to do the book, though. And that just goes to show how far back this goes. Billy was there with me, you know, Miriam was there. We were all there because we all loved this guy so much, and he became a great friend after that. And here he is parlaying me some long forgotten secret of Fortune Records, Detroit, who knows what, love. You're hearing it now. He wrote the song in the House of Correction. He was actually in there, and he proudly said, "Hell yeah, I was in there and I wrote that thing." I can't stay no more. D-Ho-Co. All right, Nate. Now, Nathaniel sets the table for the title of our book and the absolute, a song that truly, how do I even say this? It just embodies Fortune Records in all ways, shapes, and forms. Mind Over Matter by Nolan Strong, written by Deborah Brown, and it's unmistakable when you hear those lyrics that she wrote this song. It's a supernatural song. You know, he's saying, "I put a spell on you, you know, I put a hex on you, I put a spell on you," the whole 9 yards. Great guitar solo taken by Chuck Chittenden, where we do believe the Stones got Start Me Up, but it's coming right now, I think. 2 minutes? I can do it. Just keep it playing, my boy. I'm gonna talk over it. Keep it playing. The song was covered by Berry Gordy. That's actually the Temptations, the Pirates, on an early Motown record. Another label, of course, Melody. And despite the fact that the Browns had no power when it came to, you know, distributors or friends in the business or money or anything else, their version crushed the Motown version, despite, you know, Barry putting everything behind it. But that just goes to show you how much he absolutely loved the song and loved Nolan. He tried to sign him, but Nolan wouldn't leave Fortune for anything because he felt like, you know, this was my family, for better or for worse, you know. Below we see a ticket stub for the Diablos appearing in New York City, which unfortunately they did not show up for, and there was almost a riot. That was in 1960. That would be a harbinger for things to come. In the wake of Mind Over Matter, Nolan would just stop showing up for gigs. One of the big myths that's been touted around for years and years and written down in books and everything is that our good friend Lee Allen, a great legendary rock and roll DJ from here in Detroit, cut off all Fortune airplay because no one wouldn't show up for a gig at Walled Lake Casino that Lee had booked him at. Now we know that no one did not show up for that gig, but I realized when we were researching this book, nobody ever asked Lee Allen about this. So our good friend Ed Wolfram set me up with him, and I asked him the question. He said absolutely not. He'd never even heard of such a thing. So that just goes to show how these rumors get started. Nolan was just a very complicated guy, and he wasn't interested in success. This is Spider Turner right here, second from the left. Ride My 225, written by Nathaniel Mayer, a fantastic Fortune soul record. This is, the soul sweepstakes are on. Motown is ruling the roost, and everybody in Detroit is trying to start a record label. Fortune's been there from day one, and are they freaking out? Not really. They're just doing their own thing. They're making soul records, but their soul records are slightly different than everybody else's, like everything they did. And Melvin Davis was a great, he'd done was on multiple labels later, and you've heard him sing lead on "You Gotta Crawl Before You Walk" by the 8th Day and everything else, but one of his first records was for Fortune, and this goes to show the kind of gigs these guys were playing at the time. And the Utopias were Fortune's answer, a group led by a male lead singer who sounded like a woman. And I mean, absolutely, you couldn't believe he was a guy. It was incredible. David Lastly. Here he is again. And this is just absolutely fabulous and super unique. But this is, the Browns just loved these guys. And they were so young, they were teenagers. They were from way out in the country, but they drove down here and, personally managed by John B. at first, and then later our good friend Johnny Powers, who we mentioned earlier. Couple of Fortune's answer to soul music at the time, make DooWop records in the 60s after they're 5 years out of date. But yet they were so great so often. It was almost records that are out of time, and those records were picked up on by some DJs in other parts of the country. Jerry Blavat right here and Mad Mike. Jerry was from Philly, Mad Mike was from Pittsburgh. Now these guys were 60s DJs, but they loved 50s music, they loved old records. They were digging for records before that was even a thing. And they were playing obscure stuff. So any kind of new stuff that came out that had that sound, like a Fortune sound, these guys were all over it. And they had a lot to do with, spreading the Fortune gospel, so to speak, as did Pete Mad Daddy Myers down here from Cleveland. The gentleman, I don't need to say anything else. The picture speaks for itself, I do believe. As a result, Fortune started to put out albums with some of the vocal group, classics. This is the end of Fortune, and it won't last long. We go very, very deeply into it in the book, but if I may have begged for another 2 more minutes, in the 60s they were just doing all kinds of stuff. They were recording gypsy music. This is Del Rey, the legendary Romanian neighborhood in southwest Detroit that's now being destroyed for that new bridge. Just incredible stuff. No one else was recording. Giulio Bella, this guy was a truly, ahead of his time, and yet behind his time. I mean, no one was recording gypsy music back then. A lot of them came from Braddock, Pennsylvania, and there's 2 Fortune artists, believe it or not, in this photo. You look in the book and we point them out for you. Giulio and his friend Arthur Rikoski, who both made albums for Fortune. And the guy that hooks all this together is a gentleman named Billy Rose. He's playing the guitar on the right there, and he's also right here with Bob Hope. He played on all those gypsy records and, came from Braddock, Pennsylvania to Del Rey like so many others before him, and was amazing. He basically told me the whole story. He was the last guy standing, and he's still out there, still playing. Country music, they never really turned their back on it, but they absolutely renewed their faith in country music in the 60s. And down here we have Al Burnett and his Southern Swingsters. Al's still around down in Kentucky, 89 years old, and doing great. Up here we have Eddie Jackson's band in front of Webb Pierce's car. Pretty cool car, the guns for door handles, etc. And this is Patti Lynn, who made a great record with Eddie Jackson's band for Fortune around this time. and Arizona Weston, who was a DJ here and also made records. But yeah, you can look at the titles, Polecat Hollow by Jimmy Click. I mean, it just doesn't sound like something that would come out of Nashville, produced by Chet Atkins, does it? How do I get rid of that thing? Bluegrass, we haven't really talked about, and we go very, very deeply into it in the book, but bluegrass, the first time it was ever mentioned in print, you're looking at that ad right in the middle. Craig Mackey dug that up, and it wasn't a genre. It wasn't a named genre, really, until that ad came out in Billboard magazine, record label from Detroit, advertising bluegrass music. Well, there you go. The unsung, untold story of bluegrass is that it had a lot to do, its development had a lot to do with the cities as well as the country. The city was an integral part of the music, and the alienation and the confusion that people felt moving from such a rural atmosphere into such an urban, gritty place really lent it its lonesome mood. And Curly Dan and Will Mann are also deal with that on record a lot. This is a picture. They were fortunate, and as well as other label recording artists around here in Detroit. One of the greatest bluegrass groups ever, in my opinion. And they really nailed it. That song that Adam just played is North on 23. They're talking about coming to Detroit on Highway 23. And there they are in the 60s. Here they are in the 50s. Here they are in the 60s. And you'll notice it says, just back from the Grand Ole Opry, because their song South on 23, which came first, was recorded for 3 different labels, including Star Day, which is a big label down in Nashville. They got to go down to the Opry, and they sold a lot of records that way. Our good friend Ed Wolfram, who just passed away sadly a few weeks back, is the gentleman in the sweater there, and that's Andre Williams at the board at Theme Recording. This should tell you this is just a clipping of a small part of a page of a phone book from 1966. Look at all these recording companies, including Fortune and Falcon in Royal Oak, but also Hitsville, USA, in small letters down there. I guess they didn't think they needed to put theirs in bold. So a few more notes on Andre Williams and we'll be done, because he really went on, and as an example of what Fortune planted in these folks and the stewardship that they gave them, he really went on to do all kinds of great things, making tons of records for other labels. Most notably, wrote Shake a Tail Feather, which everybody knows and you should have been rich off of, as well as a few there's just a few things, but this is Andre in the 60s, hustling to every label he can, recording under different names, the Lancers, the Quality Controls, I mean, the Blue Bull. He had all kinds of, he would just make these killer records and put them out on any label that would give him money. That was Andre Williams in a nutshell. But like everything in Detroit, the riot or the rebellion defines what happened to not only Fortune Records, but so many of their contemporaries. And we go deeply into that in the book, and I won't say any more about it right now, but
Gotta wrap it up.
Armand Adams returns, the singer from the Earthquakes that I mentioned earlier, with Come Out of the Storm, which was right after the riot, put out right after the riot, but huge, a record that Browns put tons of money into and never really went where it should have.
Michael, we're closed in 10 minutes.
We're wrapping it up right now. And that's it. That's really all I have to say. I went over time as predicted, but sadly enough, this is Fortune right before it got torn down. We can talk more about that in another time, but the important stuff is what happened before it got torn down. Thank you all very much. I have books for sale, and I will sign them.